All right, ready to dive in. We've got a mountain of resources from the Illinois State Board of Ed, the ISBE, and it looks like you're really interested in how schools figure out which students need extra help with English and what kind of support they actually get. So should we just jump right in?
Let's do it. It's a pretty big deal. We're talking about more than 200,000 students just in Illinois. And get this, over 70% of those students, believe it or not, were actually born in the U.S.
70%. Seriously, I never would have guessed it was that high. It really makes you rethink those assumptions about what an English learner looks like, doesn't it?
You got it. It shows how diverse this group really is. There are neighbors, classmates, friends, and those ISBE resources you mentioned, they lay it all out, from their legal rights to how these programs are funded, how they're identified, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so let's start with the legal stuff. One thing that really stood out to me in these documents is just how much emphasis they put on protecting students' rights.
It's definitely a top priority for them. The ISBE makes it crystal clear. Every child in Illinois has an absolute right to a free public education, period. And that right isn't tied to their immigration status or their parents' immigration status.
So a school can't say, well, because of this, we can't serve your child.
Nope, they can't. They can't even ask about immigration status when a child's enrolling or ask for a Social Security number.
Wow, they're really drawing a line in the sand there. But what about funding? Schools get extra funding specifically for English learner programs, right? Can they ask about immigration status to get that funding?
It's interesting, they made a very specific exception for that. Schools can ask if a student is a newly arrived immigrant, but only so they can tap into funding that's specifically for immigrant students. It's about getting resources, not about deciding who gets services.
That's a really important distinction. They've really thought this through, haven't they? Protecting students' rights and making sure schools have the resources they need.
Exactly. And that commitment to student rights, it's everywhere in these documents. But maybe we can switch gears a bit. How do schools even know who these students are in the first place?
Yeah. How do you go about figuring out who needs language support?
Well, that's where the identification process comes in. It's designed to be thorough but fair. And it all starts with this thing called the Home Language Survey, the HLS. Every student, from preschool all the way up to 12th grade, gets this survey when they enroll in an Illinois school.
So everyone, no matter if they speak English at home or Estonian or anything else, they all get this survey.
Yep, that's right. The HLS is pretty basic. It just asks if a language other than English is spoken at home. And it's not just a simple yes or no checkbox either. They've got versions of this survey in over 40 languages because, well, Illinois schools are incredibly diverse.
Over 40 languages, that's amazing. But what happens if a parent says, yes, we speak another language at home? Does that automatically mean their kid is going into English as a second language services?
Not so fast. That home language survey, it's just the first step. If another language is flagged, that triggers the second step, which is a language proficiency assessment. Basically, they're checking to see how comfortable the child is using English.
Okay, so tell me more about these assessments. Are they all the same?
That's where it gets interesting. The assessment a student takes really depends on their grade level. It's like going to the eye doctor, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't use the same eye chart for a kindergartner as you would for an adult.
Makes sense. So what about those little ones? How does it work for them?
For the youngest learners, the ones in pre-K, they use a bunch of different methods and assessments. They're all about making it fun and engaging, watching how well they understand and speak English in different situations. And the cutoff for fluency, well, that can change depending on which assessment tool they're using. Then for kindergartners, they've got a specific tool called the WIDA Screener for kindergarten.
WIDA Screener. I'm guessing WIDA stands for something.
It does. Sorry, sometimes I get a little too into the assessment weeds. WIDA stands for World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. They're kind of a big deal in the world of English language development. Their screener for kindergarten focuses on listening and speaking skills in the first semester, and then in the second semester it expands to include reading and writing. For a student to be considered proficient, they're aiming for a combined score of 5.0.
So they're looking at all aspects of language reading, writing, listening, speaking, the whole package.
Exactly. And that same WIDA screener, it's used for older students too, from first grade through high school. They might take it online, they might take it on paper, but it's all aligned with WIDA's standards, looking at those same 4 areas of language.
And they're still shooting for that 5.0 to be considered proficient.
You got it. Consistency is key. Now, you might be wondering, what about those students who come from a different state or a different country even, where they were already identified as English learners?
That's a really good question. Do they have to start the whole process all over again?
It can be a little tricky. It really depends. If they were recently assessed in another state that uses WIDA and they weren't proficient, they'd probably be placed in EL services right away. But if they passed a similar screener somewhere else, they might not be. They really try to make sure students are getting the support they need, without any unnecessary delays.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. They're really looking at each student's individual needs, their background, all of that.
Absolutely. It's all about getting them into the right program as quickly and as smoothly as possible.
Speaking of the right program, what kind of support are we talking about here? What actually happens once a student is identified as an English learner?
Illinois has two main programs. There's Transitional Bilingual Education, which everyone calls TBE, and then there's the Transitional Program of Instruction, or TPI.
TBU and TPI, got it. What's the difference?
Okay, so imagine this. You've got one classroom where there's a large group of students who all speak Spanish at home, and then another classroom where you've only got a couple of students and they speak Mandarin.
Oh,
You'd probably approach language support a little differently in those two classrooms, right?
that makes sense. You'd want to tailor it based on how many students there are and what languages they speak.
Exactly. And that's pretty much what Illinois does. If a school has 20 or more English learners who speak the same home language, they're required to offer TBE. It's the more immersive program.
So with TBE, it's about really using the power of having that group with a shared language.
You got it. In TBE, students get instruction in English and in their native language. They're learning English, but they're also keeping up with their other subjects in a language they understand.
So they don't fall behind in math or science just because they're still working on their English.
Exactly. Now, TPI, that's for schools that have fewer than 20 English learners speaking the same language. It's a more flexible program, but with the same end goal, helping those students become proficient in English.
So both programs are working towards the same goal of getting those students confident and fluent in English. They just take different paths to get there. And what I find really great is that it's not just about those specific programs. The documents really emphasize that English learners have the same access to all other school programs too.
Absolutely. That means everything. Extracurriculars, gifted programs, college prep courses, you name it. They want to make sure these students have every opportunity to succeed, just like any other student.
I love that. No holding back just because a child is learning English. They have the right to the same opportunities.
Exactly. And to make sure that happens, Illinois has specific requirements for teachers who work with English learners. They need to have a valid teaching license, of course, but they also have to have a special endorsement to be able to teach bilingual or ESL classes.
So it's not enough to just speak another language. You need that specialized training to really support these students. It sounds like they're really serious about making sure these kids get the best support possible.
Absolutely. And they have a whole system for evaluation and monitoring to make sure those programs are actually effective.
Now, that sounds like something worth exploring further, but we'll have to save that for next time.
And we're back, diving right back into how Illinois supports its English learners.
Last time we talked about how schools figure out which students might need some extra help with English and the different programs that are out there to help them succeed.
We also talked about those important legal protections and how English learners have the same access as everyone else, whether it's AP classes or the school band.
Which is great, but I'm kind of curious, what happens when a student's made some real progress in English? How do they transition out of those special programs and into mainstream classrooms? I can't imagine it's just like flipping a switch.
You're right. It's definitely not that simple. It's a whole process. And sometimes it's not a straight line from point A to point B. Remember that Access for ELLs test we talked about? The one that tracks how their English skills are coming along?
Yeah, it's like their annual language checkup.
Exactly. Well, one of the main reasons they do that test is to help figure out when a student's ready to move on from those special programs. But it's not as easy as just hitting a certain score and saying, okay, you're good to go.
So there's more to it.
Way more to it. Think about it. A student might be talking with their friends in English just fine, but then they have to read a really complicated textbook or write an essay, and suddenly they're in over their heads. Language development isn't just about chatting with your friends, right?
So even if their speaking and listening skills are great, they might still need extra help with the academic side of English.
Exactly. So when they're deciding if a student's ready to transition out, they look at the whole picture. Their grades, how they participate in class, how well they're keeping up with the regular coursework. They want to make sure they're set up to do well in a regular classroom.
So it's really about taking a holistic approach, considering everything, not just one test score. But I'm still curious, what happens when they do transition out? Do they just get thrown into the deep end?
Not at all. The ISBE guidelines are really clear about this. They say schools have to keep monitoring those students for at least 2 years after they leave those English learner services.
2 years? That's a pretty long time.
It is, but it shows you how seriously they take this.
Mm.
During those 2 years, teachers keep a close eye on how the student is doing, making sure they're not falling behind.
So it's kind of like a safety net, just in case they start struggling after they've moved on, there's still support available.
Exactly. If their grades start slipping or if they're having a tough time keeping up, the school can step in and offer more help, even if it means they go back to those special services for a bit.
That's reassuring, knowing that there's that kind of flexibility in the system to really address each student's needs. But I have to imagine that there are still some bumps in the road. What are some of the bigger challenges you see when it comes to supporting these students?
That's a great question, and you've hit on something that often gets overlooked. The truth is that sometimes, even when everyone's trying their best, some students just don't become proficient in English as quickly as we'd like. We call them long-term English learners.
Long-term English learners. That seems a little contradictory. What exactly does that mean?
These are students who've been learning English for a while now, often 5 years or more, and they're still working towards proficiency.
I imagine that can be really frustrating, both for the students and the teachers.
It definitely can be. And it's easy to just assume that there's something wrong with a student or that the teaching isn't working, but it's usually not that straightforward. There's so many different things at play. What the student already knows, how they learn best, even if there have been any inconsistencies in the instruction they've gotten over the years.
So it's not always a sign that they're not capable or that they're not trying hard enough. There could be a lot of other factors.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to avoid those one-size-fits-all solutions. We need to meet those students where they are. We need to recognize and value their unique strengths, their experiences, all of that.
So if you're in the classroom, how do you actually go about doing that? How do you tailor the support for a student who's been learning English for years and is still having a hard time?
The first thing is to remember that those students aren't starting from scratch. They come to us with a ton of knowledge. It's just maybe not in English. It's our job to find creative ways to tap into that knowledge, maybe by doing more hands-on activities, using visual aids, even letting them share what they know in their native language.
That's a great point. Sometimes we forget that learning a language isn't just about memorizing vocabulary words and grammar rules. It's about making connections to what you already know and building on that.
I completely agree. And it also takes a lot of patience and persistence from both the students and the teachers.
Definitely. Learning a new language is hard work, especially when you've been at it for years and you're still facing challenges. Those students need to know that we believe in them, that we're rooting for them every step of the way.
Couldn't agree more. That support, knowing someone believes in your potential, can make all the difference in the world. But it's not just about what's happening in the classroom, right? There are these bigger systemic issues that affect how successful English learners can be.
And what would you say is one of the biggest hurdles?
You know, one of the biggest challenges, and it's not unique to English learners, is finding enough qualified teachers, especially teachers who have specialized training in bilingual education or ESL. And it's even harder to find those teachers in rural areas or in districts that just don't have a lot of resources.
It's like this perfect storm. There's a huge need for these specialized teachers, but just not enough people to fill those positions.
It's a really complicated problem, and there's no quick fix. But I will say that the ISBE is definitely working on it. They're creating more opportunities for teachers to earn those bilingual and ESL endorsements, and they're offering ongoing professional development to help teachers keep their skills sharp. Plus, they're being very strategic about how they allocate funding, making sure it goes where the needs are greatest.
So they're trying to tackle the problem from all angles, building up the workforce, supporting the teachers they have, and making sure the money is being used effectively.
Exactly. But even with all of those efforts, there's another systemic barrier that could really impact English learners: standardized tests.
I think I see where you're going with this. We're always measuring how students are doing with these tests, but how do you fairly assess a student who's still in the process of learning the language that test is written in?
It's a huge challenge, you're right. And while Illinois does offer some accommodations for English learners, like giving them extra time or allowing them to use dictionaries, those don't always create a level playing field. We're basically asking them to run the same race as everyone else, but with a weighted vest on.
So how do you fix that? How do you make it more equitable?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people believe we need to be more flexible with assessments, give students more ways to show what they know, like through projects or presentations, portfolios, things that go beyond just filling in bubbles on a test.
I like that. It gives them a chance to use their strengths and tap into different learning styles. What else have you heard?
Some people even think we need to completely rethink the whole system. They argue that we need to move away from these standardized tests completely and find more authentic, holistic ways to figure out what students know and what they can do.
That's definitely a conversation that's happening across the entire field of education, not just for English learners. I am curious, though, what do these ISBE documents say about assessment, especially for this group of students?
They definitely acknowledge that there are some serious challenges and stress, that it's important to use a variety of ways to measure how a student is progressing, and they encourage schools to be realistic about what those standardized tests can and can't tell us about an English learner's true abilities.
So they understand the limitations and are trying to strike a balance between holding schools accountable and being fair to the students.
Exactly. It's a work in progress, though. It's going to take a lot of discussion and some new ideas to create a system that truly works for all learners.
Well said. It's easy to get bogged down in all the policies and rules, but at the end of the day, we have to remember that there are real people involved, individual students, dedicated educators, and families that are just trying to find their way through a complicated system.
You said it. We have to keep our focus on what really matters, making sure every student, regardless of what language they speak at home, has the opportunity to succeed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've talked a lot about the big picture challenges, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure that threw a wrench into everything we've been talking about.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
That sudden shift to remote learning was tough on all students, but especially for English learners. They often rely on those face-to-face interactions, that extra support, to really thrive.
So how did schools adapt? How did they keep supporting those students when everything was turned upside down?
The ISBE really stepped up. They recognized how unique the needs of English learners were during this time and issued guidance that allowed schools to be a lot more flexible.
Oh, like what kind of flexibility?
Well, for one thing, they relaxed some of the requirements for identifying and placing students in those special programs. They knew it would be nearly impossible to give those screeners and assessments remotely, especially in those first few months when everything was so chaotic.
So it became more about just making sure students were connected to some form of support, even if it meant bending the rules a little.
Exactly. It was all about triage, meeting those immediate needs. And they also gave schools a lot more freedom in how they delivered instruction. Some schools went all in on virtual classrooms and online platforms, while others, knowing that not every family have reliable internet access, relied on paper packets, phone calls, whatever it took to stay connected.
It sounds like they were really going above and beyond to make sure those students didn't fall through the cracks.
They really were. And honestly, the creativity and dedication of so many educators during that time was amazing. But even with all of that effort, the pandemic definitely had an impact. A lot of English learners, just like other students, experienced some learning loss, but for some of them it was even more pronounced because they weren't able to get that same level of language support that they were used to.
So the pandemic might have made those existing achievement gaps even worse.
That's the worry. And it's something educators are really focused on now that we're getting back to a sense of normal.
What are they doing to try to address that? What are some of the strategies they're using to help these students catch up?
A lot of schools are pulling out all the stops. Intensive summer programs, targeted tutoring, and really focusing on building those strong relationships with families. It's about creating a network of support that surrounds those students. They're also getting a lot more creative with their teaching, personalizing it more to meet each student's unique needs.
It's about recognizing that there's no one right answer. It's about meeting students where they are and figuring out what works best for them.
Exactly. It's about creating that learning environment where students feel safe taking risks, making mistakes, and knowing that those mistakes are just opportunities to learn and grow.
That feeling of safety and belonging is so important for any student, but especially for those who are learning a new language and culture at the same time. And I think that brings us to another really important part of this conversation, the intersection of language and culture.
That's a perfect segue, and it's actually the perfect place to pick up in our next installment. We'll talk about how those cultural differences can actually impact learning, how we can make our classrooms more culturally responsive, and why family and community engagement are so essential.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into supporting English learners here in Illinois. We've covered a ton, those first steps of identifying students, figuring out the right support, even how they transition out of those programs.
And we can't forget about those bigger challenges, not enough teachers, those standardized tests, and of course, how the pandemic turned everything upside down.
It's been quite a journey, but now I really want to dig into something we've only touched on briefly, the connection between language and culture. It's something I think about a lot, how a student's background, their culture, it shapes their whole learning experience, right?
It's so important. It's easy to forget that for a lot of these students, it's not just about learning new words, it's about navigating a whole new world. New customs, new ways of talking to people, even just how you act in a classroom.
That's a lot to handle on top of everything else. I bet that can lead to some misunderstandings, don't you think?
All the time. Think about something as simple as looking someone in the eye. In some cultures, it's actually rude to look directly at a teacher. But in a lot of American classrooms, if you don't make eye contact, it seems like you're not paying attention, or even that you're being disrespectful.
Wow, that's a perfect example. A student who's trying to be respectful, at least in their mind, might be seen as disruptive or rude just because of those cultural differences.
Exactly. And that's just one tiny example. Culture affects everything in learning how students talk to each other, how they solve problems. That's why it's so important for teachers to be what we call culturally competent.
So it's not just about being a good teacher, it's about being a culturally responsive teacher, too.
Right. It means being aware of your own biases, making sure you understand your students' backgrounds, and then creating a classroom where everyone feels welcome, where their voice matters. It's about seeing those differences as strengths, not weaknesses.
That makes so much sense. But it's a lot for teachers to take on. Are there resources that can help them, to build that cultural competency?
Tons. Books, articles, professional development, you name it.
Mm.
The ISBE even has specific guidelines on this kind of teaching, this culturally responsive teaching. They want teachers to really get to know their students and their families, to learn about their backgrounds, and to bring those different viewpoints into their lessons.
So it's not just about teaching about different cultures in a superficial way, it's about weaving it into everything you do in the classroom.
Exactly. And a huge part of that is working with families. We talked about family engagement before, but it's even more crucial when we're talking about English learners.
I agree, but I imagine it can be really tough for parents who don't speak English to get involved.
That language barrier is a real challenge. But remember, schools are required to provide interpreters and translators so that every parent can understand what's going on, participate in meetings, and advocate for their child's needs.
So the systems are there to make sure communication can happen, even with those language differences.
Right. And even if a parent isn't fluent in English, they're still their child's first teacher, the most important one. They can support their language development just by talking to them in their native language, sharing their traditions, creating that rich language environment at home.
So it's not about replacing their first language with English, it's about making space for both.
Exactly. And it's about instilling that love of learning, that feeling of pride in their heritage. And those things, those go way beyond language barriers.
It's such a powerful message. You belong here. Your language matters. Your culture matters.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And schools can reinforce that message in so many ways by making families feel welcome, hosting events that celebrate different cultures, inviting parents into the classroom to share their stories.
Mhm.
It's about building those connections and recognizing that education is a two-way street.
It really does take a village. And speaking of villages, we can't forget about all the community groups that do so much to support these families.
They are amazing. Community organizations are often the unsung heroes in all of this. After-school programs, English classes for parents, cultural events, they're filling in the gaps and meeting needs that schools often can't.
They're able to give that really specific support, that culturally sensitive support that can make such a difference.
Exactly. And they're often a lifeline for families that are new to the community, or maybe they're just not sure how the school system works. It's about building that safety net, that support system that goes beyond the school building itself.
It sounds like it takes a true community effort. And it really highlights the fact that supporting English learners isn't just about academics. It's about creating a welcoming, inclusive space where every student can thrive.
Perfectly said. It's about recognizing how much these students and families bring to our communities, about celebrating all those languages and cultures, and it's about making sure that every student, no matter where they're from or what language they speak, has the chance to succeed.
I've learned so much from diving into these resources with you. It feels like we've just scratched the surface, but we've uncovered so much about how Illinois supports its English learners.
I agree. We've talked about the ins and outs of the policies, the challenges of teaching, and the power of being culturally responsive. But more than anything, I hope our listeners have a better understanding of these amazing students, their resilience, and the incredible educators who go above and beyond for them every day.
Me too. And to everyone listening, keep learning. Read a book, go to a community event, volunteer at a school. There are so many ways to get involved and make a difference in the lives of English learners.
And remember, we all have a role to play in building a fairer, more inclusive world. When we embrace diversity, when we speak up for English learners, when we celebrate their unique talents, we create a brighter future for everyone.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep asking those questions, keep diving deep.